Okay, we'll get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Nova Scotia Offshore Wind Call for Information webinar hosted by the Atlantic Offshore Wind Coalition. Thank you for joining us this evening as we dive into the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulators Offshore Wind Call for Information, which is NS25-1R, Public Engagement Opportunities. Our aim this evening is to break down the offshore wind call for information and where it fits within the offshore wind licensing process within Nova Scotia. We'll also identify how you can get involved by sharing your knowledge and perspective during this important public engagement opportunity. As I mentioned, the webinar this evening is being hosted by the Atlantic Offshore Wind Coalition, which is a partnership between the Ecology Action Centre, East Coast Environmental Law, and Sierra Club Canada Foundation. Together, our work across the provinces of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador takes place within the traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq people, the Yup'ik, Innu, and Inuit. The Atlantic Offshore Wind Coalition is working to support the renewable energy transition by advancing responsible offshore wind development as a key part of Atlantic Canada's clean energy future. We believe that developed responsibly, offshore wind combined with energy storage, efficiency upgrades, and strong ocean protections can create local jobs, benefit communities, and play a vital role in decarbonizing Canada's power grid. By working directly with communities and folks like yourselves, we help identify social, environmental, and community benefits that will lay the foundation for a just transition to renewable energy and a cleaner, more resilient electricity grid. Hello, everyone. My name is Shauna Kelly, and I'll be your moderator this evening. I'm the Offshore Wind Coordinator for Newfoundland and Labrador with Sierra Club Canada Foundation. At Sierra Club, we empower people to be leaders in protecting, restoring, and enjoying healthy and safe ecosystems, which for us means championing a rapid transition to clean energy and fighting for environmental and social justice. Here in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Nova Scotia, we believe responsible offshore wind development is a key piece of a just energy transition. Joining me today are my colleagues Tina Northrup from East Coast Environmental Law and Renee Fougere from Ecology Action Centre. My colleague Colleen Freak with Ecology Action Centre is also with us here taking notes in the background and here to help troubleshoot any tech difficulties. We'll be recording the webinar this evening. The recording, along with any important links we mention, will be shared with you via email and publicly on our website. If you have interested colleagues, neighbors, friends, or family that weren't able to join us today, please do share the recording and information with them afterwards. Before I hand it over to Tina and Renee, I also wanted to let you know that we'll have time to answer questions following their presentations. Please drop your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll bring those questions forward at the end. If you're comfortable doing so, please also briefly introduce yourself and where you're coming from when asking your question. We won't share your name aloud, but it will help us know who's in the room here and follow up with you afterwards if needed. So with those couple of housekeeping things, I'll hand it over to Tina.
Thanks very much, Shauna, and hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Tina Northrup, and I'm a staff lawyer at East Coast Environmental Law. And I'm going to share my screen and pull up a presentation, so just bear with me for a moment. Okay, so our webinar tonight, as Shauna mentioned, is about the call for information that the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulator issued roughly a month and a half ago. We're going to be talking about how it fits within the licensing process for offshore wind, the broader regulatory process that offers a little bit of context for this licensing round that we are approaching at this point. And we'll talk a little bit about how to participate and why. Before I dive into my presentation, I'd like to say just a few words about East Coast Environmental Law. As I mentioned, I'm a staff lawyer with East Coast Environmental Law, and East Coast Environmental Law is a regional charity that works throughout all 4 provinces in Atlantic Canada, providing public interest environmental law services. The vision of the organization is a future in which laws and legal systems support ecological health and promote environmental and climate justice. And to that end, we advocate for progressive environmental law and policy. We provide public legal education on environmental law topics, and we share our legal skills in an effort to support others who are working to prevent or redress environmental harms. And that includes support to community groups, to individuals navigating environmental law processes with a public interest community aspect, and to other environmental non-governmental organizations working in these spaces as well. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about our work and what we do and how we're engaged on offshore wind, you can email us at admin@ecolaw.ca. And if you have specific environmental law questions, I want to flag that we operate a free environmental law inquiry service, and it's accessible through our website. You can ask us environmental law questions, ask for a little bit of guidance navigating environmental law processes like environmental impact assessments, and you can do that by filling out an inquiry intake form that's on our website at the address provided here. And as Shauna mentioned, we'll be sharing slides and information after this webinar tonight. And before moving on, I'll just say that East Coast Environmental Law is an organization that works throughout all 4 provinces in Atlantic Canada, and an organization that's advocating for environmental and climate justice. We are also very passionate about supporting Indigenous rights and advocating for Indigenous rights recognition. And it's important to us to recognize the unceded and ancestral territories on which we work throughout this region, and important for us to be striving to uphold the treaties, both historical and modern, that apply throughout Atlantic Canada as we do our work in this region. So my presentation tonight is going to focus on the regulatory process to which this call for information belongs. And to do that, I'll be talking not only about the licensing for offshore wind projects and how that works and how it's designed. I'll also be saying a little bit about the assessment and authorization of offshore wind projects, just to help us better understand how this licensing process as a whole fits into a bigger picture that ultimately is going to be leading to offshore wind development in part of the ocean around Nova Scotia. So focus is definitely on the licensing process, but with a little bit of broader context, broader assessment and authorization information to help situate us tonight and situate more specifically how this call for information is going to fit into to more longer and more complicated processes that are all working together ultimately to lead to the outcome that we're expecting to see in the next little while. So the call for information that we're discussing tonight was issued in mid-October, so I think roughly 6 weeks ago, as I noted earlier. And there's an engagement period roughly 3 months long that was initiated when the call for information was issued. So responses to the call for information will be due in mid-January, and my colleague Renee will be saying a little bit more about how you can submit responses and get involved during this engagement process and the window for public comment that's available now. The call for information is one of several policy steps that are leading up to what we expect will be the first call for bids for submerged land licenses at some point next year, possibly in the late spring or early summer. Submerged land licenses are licenses that offshore wind developers will need ultimately in order to proceed with developing offshore wind projects. And as I'll explain in more detail in just a few moments, the submerged land licenses are really foundational regulatory instruments. They are not the be-all and end-all of this regulatory process, and they are actually the first major legal instrument that developers will need to secure before going on to get further approvals and authorizations. So this the licensing process that is on the horizon right now is a very important process, and the engagement opportunity that is occurring right now is going to be really crucial in terms of shaping what happens in the months to come. But it's by no means the only or the last engagement opportunity, and it's by no means the final opportunity for interested persons to get involved and have a say in how they think offshore wind projects should be developed and how they should be monitored and what should be the terms and conditions that are placed on them in order to ensure that environmental harms are minimized and the effects are good and beneficial to local communities on the whole. So as you can see from the image here, the call for information is the last step in a number of policy steps that are leading up to steps that are actually set out in legislation. And I'll dig into this a little bit deeper in just a moment. I do just want to recognize that this image, apart from the dark blue arrow pointing to the call for information pre-qualification box, is an image taken from a document provided by Natural Resources Canada and the Nova Scotia Department of Energy last March when they began a public engagement on the designation of wind energy areas. So I'll be using this image throughout my presentation tonight just to periodically situate us and be reminding us of where we are at any point in our discussion about the licensing steps that we have seen and that we'll be seeing in the next little while. So, as I've noted, a submerged land license is in many ways a foundational legal instrument within this context. It's a first big step for an offshore wind developer. The submerged land license is ultimately going to give an offshore wind developer an exclusive right to pursue an offshore wind project within the license area. But doing that is going to require seeking further approvals and authorizations. So the license is not it's not an absolute license that authorizes everything and every aspect of an offshore wind project. It really just gives certain legal rights and interests in the license area, in the marine space to which the license refers. And from there, the offshore wind developer that holds the license can go on to seek further approvals and authorizations for the project they propose. Now, the regulatory process that we'll be discussing tonight and the laws that govern this process, they're part of a legal regime that was established quite recently by the Government of Canada and the Government of Nova Scotia through mirrored statutes called the Accord Acts. Now, the process is one that has a number of steps required by law in the Accord Acts, and you can see them in the image presented here. The brackets saying steps prescribed in legislation are the steps that are actually required by law under the Accord Acts. And then there are a number of steps, and the call for information is one of them, that are actually policy commitments and not legal requirements that are obligatory under the Accord Acts. So the call for information is part of a relatively robust series of policy steps to which the Government of Canada and the Government of Nova Scotia committed in order to lay a foundation for the licensing process that the Accord Acts require. So, as we'll see in just a few moments, these policy steps have involved the conduct of a regional assessment. They've involved wind energy area designation with opportunities for public feedback. They've involved strategic direction from the federal and provincial ministers who are responsible for the Accord Acts in this context. And now it's involving this call for information and also pre-qualification process that's running simultaneously with this call for information. So these policy steps, in my view, have been very important commitments that have allowed the governments to show considerable inclusivity and a desire to create participatory processes for members of the public, for other ocean users who are active in the space, including fisheries, for Indigenous rights holders to be able to get involved in shaping what will ultimately be an offshore wind regime in the ocean around Nova Scotia. Now, the Accord Acts that I've mentioned are two statutes. We won't be describing them in detail tonight, but worth just flagging them. One is a federal statute and one is a Nova Scotian statute, and they're designed to have essentially the same contents, just with some nuances and changes for context, given the different legal authorities of the federal and the provincial government. So these statutes apply within a defined offshore area, and that offshore area covers most, but not all, of the ocean around Nova Scotia. But what we're seeing right now in the area that is governed by the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulator, that area is the Accord Acts regime that we'll be discussing tonight. Any potential offshore wind developments that might happen in the future in certain bays, for example, in Nova Scotia, that aren't covered by the Accord Acts, they wouldn't be subject to the processes that we'll be describing and discussing tonight. They would be going forward under a different regime that would be primarily provincial. So that's not a topic of discussion tonight. Our focus here is on the Accord Acts regime and the policy and obligatory legal requirements of that regime as it's been developed. Now, under the Accord Acts regime for offshore wind, there are three key players who are primarily responsible for offshore wind regulation. And I'll say the Accord Act's regime for offshore wind is actually a broader regime for all offshore renewable energy development. It's not specific to offshore wind, but right now, offshore wind is the technology that everybody is focused on under the Accord Acts and is the technology that we will be most likely to be seeing in the immediate future. So the key players with the main regulatory responsibilities under this regime are Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, and the regime refers to them as the federal minister. Nova Scotia's Minister of Energy, who is currently our premier, that they are referred to as the provincial minister within this regime. And then we have the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulator, either the CNSOER or the regulator. Both of those terms are used to refer to them. I'm going to say just a little bit about the respective roles of the ministers and the regulator, just as part of the foundation for what we'll then be looking at in a little bit more detail when we turn to the licensing process writ large. So the federal minister and the provincial minister within the offshore wind regime under the Accord Acts, they really do need to work together to carry out most of their regulatory roles. So the key decisions that they need to make and the authority that they can exercise within this part of the Accord Acts is authority that they exercise jointly. They're making their decisions together jointly, and they need to be in lockstep in that way. Their roles include giving strategic direction to the CNSOER. They have the ultimate authority to approve CNSOER recommendations to make calls for bids. So that means that it's ultimately up to them whether or not the CNSOER will initiate competitive licensing processes. And they also hold the ultimate authority for approving or theoretically rejecting CNSOER recommendations as to which offshore wind developers, if any, will be given submerged land licenses after a call for bid process has concluded. The CNSOER, by contrast, is responsible for preparing and making recommendations to the ministers and then taking the ministers' ultimate decisions and implementing them. The regulator is responsible as well for most of the day-to-day, I would say on the ground, but I guess on the water requirements of offshore wind regulation. The CNSOER is going to be the body that is responsible for overseeing the nitty-gritty of authorization and enforcement. They're going to oversee the construction, operation, and ultimately decommissioning of offshore wind projects. They're going to be playing roles in federal impact assessments of offshore wind projects and potentially carrying out other aspects of environmental reviews. They will implement strategic direction from the federal minister and provincial minister, and they will be the body recommending how calls for bids ought to go forward, if at all. They'll also be the body evaluating bids from developers and recommending to the ministers what developers they think ought to get submerged land licenses in order to be able to go forward and pursue offshore wind development within licensed areas. Now, having situated the key roles, the key players under the Accord Act's regime for offshore wind development, I want to turn now back to the licensing process and look a little bit more closely at the policy steps that preceded where we are now. So led up to the call for information, which is where we are now. We began with a regional assessment of offshore wind development in Nova Scotia. It was initiated in March 2023 and it concluded early this year in January 2025. The regional assessment was what we call a high-level assessment process. It had an independent regional assessment committee, which was appointed by the federal and provincial governments, and the committee, over the course of its work, gathered an enormous amount of information about the predicted effects of introducing offshore wind into the part of the ocean around Nova Scotia that's governed under the Accord Acts. So the committee was looking at what would be the environmental effects, both positive and negative. Positive effects, of course, being the potential to support decarbonization in the context of climate emergency, negative being potential negative impacts on marine birds, bats, species. So regulator gathering information about that, drawing conclusions where it could, and also identifying important information gaps. I said the regulator, but I meant the regional assessment committee. The Regional Assessment Committee also gathered information on potential socioeconomic impacts, on impacts to Aboriginal and treaty rights, all the kinds of big issue areas that were considered to be important for making an informed decision on whether or not offshore wind development should be introduced to this space, and how the Regional Assessment Committee did their best to gather what they could and put it together, and then recommend next steps to improve knowledge and continue to define best practices if offshore wind development is going to go forward. The committee also identified a number of potential future development areas that were areas where, in the committee's view, there were the fewest or the least significant conflicts with other ocean users or ecosystem needs in the offshore. So I know this map is small, but you can see 5 areas that are outlined in black lines. The northernmost is the area of Sydney Bight, and then below that there's French Bank and Middle Bank. And then below that, Sable Island Bank, and the large one to the bottom left is Western Emerald Bank. So in the committee's view, these were areas where offshore wind development could be most suitable in the sort of near future, so maybe over the next decade or so to come. Now, from the Regional Assessment Committee's work and from the committee's identification of potential future development areas, the Government of Nova Scotia and Government of Canada then moved forward to begin a process of designating wind energy areas. So this is the second step in the 4 policy commitment steps that conclude ultimately with the call for information where we are now. So the 2 governments initiated this process in March of last year. They issued a discussion paper inviting feedback on 5 proposed wind energy areas. And those proposed wind energy areas were quite similar to, but not exactly the same as the potential future development areas that the Regional Assessment Committee had identified. So same general areas, but differences in size and the actual boundaries of the areas. Ultimately, after the public engagement process that the 2 governments held, they took what they heard, they took the feedback, and they ultimately decided in July of this year to designate just 4 wind energy areas. So these are the areas outlined in red on the map that you see here. So they're not named in this map, but the northernmost is again Sydney Bight. And then under that, the 2 beside each other are Middle Bank and French Bank. And then under that, the area of Sable Island Bank. So ultimately, the governments decided not to designate the proposed Western Emerald Bank area as a wind energy area. So that for now is off the table as an area where offshore wind development may occur. Following the designation of those 4 wind energy areas, in September of this year, the federal minister and provincial minister under the Accord Acts issued a strategic direction to the CNSOER, directing the regulator to initiate a call for information and simultaneously a pre-qualification process, both of which are designed to inform the first call for bids for submerged land licenses for offshore wind developments within the Canada-Nova Scotia offshore area under the Accord Acts. So we're now in the 3rd of the 4 policy commitment steps in the image that I've been using this evening. The strategic direction that the ministers issued directed the regulator to seek information about potential parcels that could be opened to wind development within 3 of the designated wind energy areas that were designated this summer. So Sydney Bight, French Bank, and Middle Bank. Importantly, the Sable Island Bank wind energy area is not now being considered within this call for information as an area for potential wind energy development in this first licensing round. So the strategic direction from the federal minister and provincial minister effectively took Sable Island Bank off of the table for this first licensing round, and the focus is on Sydney Bight, French Bank, and Middle Bank. And ultimately, the purpose of the call for information that we're in now, and the information that the regulator is inviting interested parties to contribute, the purpose is, well, one of the important purposes is to identify specific parcels within Sydney Bight, French Bank, and Middle Bank that could be particularly suitable and that should be opened within the call for bids that is expected to happen next year. Now, the strategic direction that the two ministers issued to the CNSOER invited feedback on, or directed the CNSOER to invite feedback on a number of topics. I've already mentioned that it instructed the CNSOER to collect feedback on specific parcels that could be opened to bids within Sydney Bight, Middlebank, and French Bank wind energy areas. The strategic direction also instructed the regulator to invite feedback on the specific bidding criteria that should be used to inform bids. So these would be a criteria that developers would need to speak to in their bid packages during a call for bids process. My colleague Renee will be saying a little bit more about these, so I won't go into detail with them here. So I'll just say, kind of put a bit of a tab on that, and we'll be coming back to it. The regulator is also meant to be collecting information about how it should be evaluating the bids that it receives, weighing the different criteria. This process is also collecting information about the terms and conditions that should ultimately be included in the submerged land licenses that could be issued as a result of the call for bids that's expected next year. Where the regulator is also gathering information on possibility for fisheries compensation. So we've been invited to provide feedback on that, as well as being invited to provide feedback on possibilities for community benefit plans. So this is all contained within the strategic direction from the ministers, and that strategic direction is shaping the call for information that the CNSOER has now issued. So quite a detailed direction from the ministers and quite a lot of nuance and parameters for the regulator to then bring forward in this call for information process. So in thinking about, what are the ultimate outcomes and purposes of this call for information and how does it fit within this broader regime, just to recap and synthesize what I've been saying already. The call for information ultimately is going to give the CNSOER quite a lot of information, ideally from knowledge holders, from interested persons, from stakeholders and Indigenous rights holders. It's going to give the regulator information that it can then consider and synthesize, and that it can then use ultimately to shape the recommendation that it will ultimately make to the federal and provincial ministers about the nature and shape of a call for bids that could be made next year. Again, probably in the late spring or the early summer. So I would expect that at the end of this call for information process, and as the regulator is reviewing and considering and synthesizing the information it receives, they will be using what it collects now to ultimately choose specific parcels that it will recommend to be opened to bidding by developers. They will also be recommending the bidding criteria that it should use, or that it should tell developers to speak to in their bid packages, and then the evaluation methods that it will use to evaluate the bids it receives. This is also the opportunity to comment on specific terms and conditions that will then be included within the submerged land licenses that developers receive. So this moment that we're in right now is a really important one for laying the foundation for the bidding process that will happen in the competitive tendering process that developers will be participating in next year, and then also shaping what will be the outcomes of that and the contents of the submerged land licenses that the developers will receive. And again, those submerged land licenses will not in and of themselves be the complete authorization package that they'll need to then proceed with offshore wind developments. The submerged land licenses will be the foundational instruments that allow developers to then pursue the next approvals and authorizations that they'll need to actually go forward and construct and operate their wind projects. So the final thing I'll say about all of this is that because the license is not the final step, but really a first big step, it's important, I think, in this moment to be thinking about the opportunities that will come long after this process, or long maybe is too strong a word, but sometime after this process, when there will be opportunities to be thinking about the shape and specific design of a project that's being proposed in this space. So currently, Canada's Impact Assessment Act requires federal impact assessments of offshore wind projects that are 10 or more turbines large. So an offshore wind developer who secures a submerged land license following a call for bid process will then be expected to go on to submit a project proposal to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada that will initiate a federal impact assessment. And for projects that trigger the impact assessment process is going to be a process that will likely be lasting roughly 2 years, possibly more. Right now, the federal government's working to streamline to get it within a 2 year timeline. And that process will be considering the specific proposed technical design and kind of parameters of the proposed project, what would be the expected environmental, kind of human, socioeconomic impacts of that project, what ought to be the monitoring requirements and information reporting requirements and all the rest. So there are a number of things about kind of project impacts that will be addressed at the impact assessment stage. And right now, at the stage where we're thinking about the call for bids and the submerged land license, our focus is really about what is going to create the best decision-making process that will choose the best developers and the kind of right foundations for the projects that will ultimately be constructed in the space. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'll simply note that my colleague Renee will pick up on a number of these themes in her presentation. And if you'd like more information about the work that East Coast Environmental Law is doing in this space, I would invite you to consult our online resource library and simply use the search term offshore wind, and that will pull up a number of research reports and submissions to government and another work that we've done in this area. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions during the Q&A.
Hello. Bear with me while I switch over to share my screen. Looking okay?
Yep, we can see Renee.
Great, cool. All right. Thank you, Tina and Shauna, and Colleen in the background too. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. My name is Renee Fougere. I am the Offshore Wind Coordinator for the Ecology Action Centre, and I live and work in Jabuktuk, Halifax. The Ecology Action Centre is a member-based environmental charity in Nova Scotia. Since 1971, we have taken leadership on critical environmental issues, from biodiversity protection to climate change to environmental justice. I want to begin by setting the stage for this evening, in that our goal is to resource our listeners and not to present our own positions. Offshore wind is a complex subject, and it will take a village of expertise and insight to guide its responsible development here in Atlantic Canada. We all have something unique and valuable to offer this conversation. As our positions become clearer in the coming weeks, we will be eager to share them with others, as well as to learn the positions that others have taken. We will undoubtedly continue to learn a great deal from each other in the near and long term. I'm going to discuss how to participate and why, getting more into the real, like, direct and how you can get involved. So jumping right in on how to participate. We're not all on the same technological pages in terms of engagement, so bear with me as I kind of walk through this quite gently. To participate, you can go to the Regulator's website. To do this, you can Google Canada Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulator. And I've included their logo here for you to refer to so you know what you're looking for. And alternatively, you can go to the search bar or just like your little browser bar, and you can type in https://cnsoer.ca. From there, once you get to their homepage, there is an image with windmills. And if you click that, it'll bring you to another page. And then there's a middle block that says offshore wind call for information. And you want to click that middle block. And then it'll bring you to another page and you want to click the middle block again. It will say offshore wind call for information and then public engagement opportunities. So you want to click that one. And that will bring you to a page that has links, lots of links. It has the call for information feedback form that you will use to submit your feedback, as well as the recording of the regulators webinar that was held last Tuesday, and the form to nominate the geographic parcels for consideration for development if that's something you want to do. And so here is the top of the form window. There are a few important things to note when submitting your feedback. Anything accompanied by an asterisk means that that's a mandatory field. And if you don't know what an asterisk is, it's kind of raised up like a power number, like power of 2. It's raised up and it is that little snowflake star. And that means that that's a mandatory field that you have to fill out. You have to, so for example, you can see here, you have to include your name, email, organization, any other kind of demographic data they're seeking. If you are submitting feedback as an individual rather than a member of an organization, the form says to please write NA, so capital N / capital A, meaning not applicable, but it's important that you do that. If you don't comply with mandatory field specifications, it is possible that your submission may be discarded. There's also kind of right toward the top, there's the 2 check boxes, and use those check boxes to indicate whether or not you consent to your submission being included, like published in the What We Heard report. So kind of scrolling down on that form a bit, here is an example from the form where it is seeking feedback on a specific topic. As you can see, it includes some kind of background context for each of the input boxes. The feedback input boxes are, anyone who's used one of these forms knows that the little input boxes are awkward to use. They're not super user friendly. So my recommendation is to craft your response in maybe Google Doc or Microsoft Word, so you can type and edit your responses, and so that you're more comfortable in the process, and then copy and paste your responses into the relevant boxes when you're ready. Alternatively, if you scroll down to the very bottom of the form, it says that if you would prefer to submit your comments in a Microsoft Word document or as an Adobe PDF, that you can do that. You can like drag and drop your files into that little box, I think, and that will upload documents to attach to your submission. Just be very careful if you are using just a straight Word document, that's what you're sending. Be very clear as to what box you are speaking to at any given time. That will help whoever's on the back end of this data collection experience. It will make their job a lot easier, and it will make sure that all of the feedback you're submitting is reaching the right targets. You don't want really important feedback to get kind of lost in the fray. So that will make sure that it all lands where it's supposed to. So in terms of what are the boxes on the form, there are 10 in total, and specifically they are requesting suggestions and feedback on the wind energy areas and factors that they will consider in designing the parcels, specific criteria for the bids, the criteria weighting, scoring metrics and evaluation methods that will be used to assess the qualifications of different operator proponents, coexistence with other industries, considerations for fisheries compensation, the fees for bid submissions and successful bidders, considerations and adherence to the principles listed in the Accord Acts, possible considerations for community benefit programs related to offshore wind development, possible terms and conditions for submerged land licenses, considerations for a participant funding program, and space for any additional feedback and comments that you might have to offer. So now that we've gone over the direct mechanics of how you can participate, we're going to touch on each topic more deeply and clarify why each is important. So what specific information is kind of outlined in the strategic direction? What information are they really calling for at this time? The first is parcel identification, which refers to that really fine scale site selection, the drawing of geographic boundaries in which development may occur within each wind energy area. So basically this is one of the most important parts really of this call for information process. This fine scale site selection is how we can avoid and minimize harm to important fishing areas, culturally important sites, marine wildlife, and sensitive habitats. If you know, if there's anything specific, any kind of a specific area within each of these wind energy areas that is not suitable for offshore wind development, please contribute that information to the call for information. It's really important that we know we have a sense of where is like really pretty off limits, where there's going to be a big fuss. Now is a really good time to communicate that information. So in the parcel identification process, the regulator is seeking nominations specifically that adequately balance and consider multiple priorities within the space, reflect moderate turbine spacing, consider future development in terms of things like substation locations or wind theft or wind shadow, and then making sure that the nominations for parcels meet specific criteria outlined for each wind development area, which I will go over in more depth in a couple of slides. So in terms of when they say that they want to balance multiple marine priorities, they are considering, on one hand, whether the parcel is a good candidate for wind power generation. Is it relatively close to shore, grid and transmission opportunities, ports, goods and services? And does it make sense in terms of the prevailing wind strength and direction? And on the other hand, we look at the other uses of the marine space. So does it coincide with other valuable marine uses like shipping and navigation corridors, fisheries, areas deemed off limits by right holders, marine protected areas, sensitive benthic habitats, or species at risk? So the regulator has requested that nominations be made in each of the three wind energy areas. Specifically, they are hoping for one or more parcels with 500 megawatt capacity or more for fixed bottom turbines and Sydney Bight. Two or more parcels, each with 1,000 megawatt capacity in Middlebank, and one or more parcels with 500 megawatt capacity for floating turbines in French Bank. Also considering a buffer to avoid overlap with an abandoned pipeline that runs through that area. And if you're looking for that kind of geographic information, the regulator on their website does have a mapping tool, like an online mapping tool, where you can where you can visualize different data sets. That includes this pipeline. I went looking when I read it, and it was on there, and you can download, if you're really into GIS, you can download those files as well, those different geographic data sets. So that's available if you need it. And in terms of what they've outlined for these criteria for these different sites, it aligns with the government's plan to grant submerged land licenses totaling 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. This first round of nominations seems to indicate that the intention is to spread out the development rather than focus it in one energy area. So seems wise to me, in my opinion. And so now, now we're getting into the bid criteria that Tina had mentioned before. And bid criteria refers to the criteria that will be used to assess proponent applications. This is how we are going to evaluate whether operators are qualified to apply for the submerged land licenses and then participate in the rest of the process. So are they a good business case is kind of where it starts. Do they have the expertise, the experience, the financial ability to establish and potentially operate and maintain and then decommission a wind farm here? And then also, are they willing to offer what are they willing to offer Nova Scotia in terms of community engagement, direct material benefits, financial compensation, local investment and employment, and making sure that they're going to minimize environmental harm. And it's important to, I think, for us as members of the public to kind of sit with how some of these things like community benefits are not necessarily a given. They are cards on the table for sure, and that's great. We love to see that. But it will take advocacy and research on behalf of rights holders and stakeholders to ensure that these cards are kept in play. This is why it's important for us to advocate for what we want to see in our collective energy future. And also to mention here that the regulator is also seeking guidance on criteria weighting, scoring metrics and evaluation methods, as well as the Accord Acts. Terms and conditions for submerged land licenses refers to the longer term agreements between the government and the regulator and the operators. Licenses are expected to last for 35 years or longer. These terms and conditions, like this is kind of the long game. So what kind of assessments and engagement programs, community benefits, support for local goods and services, monitoring and reporting, coexistence regimes do we want to see long term, 20, 30 years from now? And so one of the things that's really interesting about the case here in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada at large is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Industry, government, academics, communities around the world have developed guidance documents to support the safe, smooth operation of the sector, and we can learn from them. If you know of best practice frameworks and guidance documents to support any aspect of this industry, because there's a lot of moving parts. Anything in terms of guidance documents that you have to offer that could help support this industry and making sure that it's done right, please offer them to this call for information. We don't have all the answers, but it is incumbent on all of us to really dig into what has been successful elsewhere and advocate for its application here in the birth of our industry here in Atlantic Canada. So we hope that you will have your say to help inform site selection so that we can avoid valuable and sensitive areas, how operator qualifications are assessed, what we can expect to see and receive in the long term from this industry, and the protocols that will underpin every facet of this industry. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina and Renee, for those very in-depth, thorough presentations. I know, especially coming at this being a newer industry, a new sector for our region, it's important to have these broken down and for everybody to have a clear picture of how we can engage in these processes. So thank you very much. We do have a few questions coming in, and I'll start bringing those forwards. And just a reminder for folks on the call here, If you have questions that came up during the presentation or that you came here wanting to ask, please drop those into the Q&A box and we'll bring those up. So our first question coming in was interested in what effects the decision of Premier Houston to declare himself Minister of Energy are likely to have as this process moves forward. So Tina, I think you mentioned this as him as the minister. And with that, are you aware of any precedents for a provincial premier intervening in a complex regulatory process like this one on any other environmental issue at the scale of the wind decision process? And if so, what could Nova Scotians learn from these experiences in other provinces? So kind of what impacts or could that have?
Thanks, Shauna, and I'm happy to speak to that. I'll say off the bat that I'm not aware of other examples of this. It doesn't mean they haven't happened. It just means that I'm not aware. And in terms of, potential impacts or what I think this signals, I think that really this is a move by Premier Houston to show his commitment to offshore wind and his commitment to making this happen. I don't see this as being, I think the words kind of intervene in a phrasing was, intervene in a complex regulatory process. I don't see this um, as being an intervention in quite the same way, if I'm understanding the tenor of the question correctly, because ultimately in this process, the regulator is going to be doing most of the heavy lifting when it comes to assessing information and synthesizing, information and feedback and making informed recommendations about what ought to be happening in this space. And the job of the federal minister and the provincial minister is to evaluate the recommendations from the CNSOER and say yes or no. And in most cases, I think that they would be likely to say yes, particularly given the interest that we've seen in supporting the sector. So I don't think that Premier Houston's move to step into the Minister of Energy role is a move to intervene in the regulatory process. I think it's really about signaling very clearly that he wants this to happen and he wants to be seen to be making it happen. And I think that um, although I can recognize that, some would certainly feel concerned about the about um, about government representatives, throwing themselves so wholeheartedly behind an industry, and frankly, that's something that our organizations, as environmental non-governmental organizations, would instinctively be concerned about as well. I also think it's important to say that, in our current global political moment, when we're seeing so much regression when it comes to climate policy and when it comes to, and then acceleration of climate denialism and a kind of resurgence of popular climate denialism. I think it's actually really important for our government leaders to be coming out and saying renewable energy transition is really important and we need to make it happen. So I think that there are a lot of nuances to all of this, of course, but speaking personally, and certainly I think my colleagues at East Coast Environmental Law would share this perspective. We don't see this as a move to interfere with the regulatory process. We see it really as a move to say the transition is really important. The opportunities for this industry are really important, and Nova Scotia, or the government of Nova Scotia, is behind it.
Thank you, Tina. Our next question, Tina, that I'll also direct to you is, if the industry receiving the license will already be required to carry out an environmental impact assessment, then why is another EIA needed? Wasn't this assessment already completed during the regional assessment of the wind farm site?
Well, thanks for that, and that's a good question. And this is something that I think is, it's fairly it's a question that we've heard before, and I think we'll hear a lot more. So I think important to understand that the regional assessment that happened was not actually an environmental impact assessment in the way that we normally think of those. So when we talk about federal impact assessments or provincial environmental assessments here in Nova Scotia, those assessments are project-specific assessment processes. So we're looking at a specific project that's been proposed. You usually have specific technological design, or at the very least, a design package that maybe offers a few options and a final decision hasn't been made, but you're able to assess what the predicted outcomes of each option would be. And you're thinking about how those specific technologies have been used before, what the impacts have been, and then you're making predictions and inferences about what would be the likely impact of that specific project in a specific location. The regional assessment of offshore wind development in Nova Scotia didn't do that because it wasn't an assessment of any specific project. It was a very high level assessment of an absolutely enormous study area that looked at, in this huge marine space, what would be the likely impacts of introducing offshore wind. And there wasn't an analysis of, okay, what's it going to look like if it's 1,000 turbines or 3,000 turbines or 5,000 turbines? Not saying we'll get that many, but we didn't do that kind of, or we didn't see that kind of math being done. It was really at a high level. What do these projects do in a marine space? What can we learn from other jurisdictions? And what kinds of questions should we be asking when we get to the stage of doing specific project assessments? And I think worth noting that the Regional Assessment Committee made a clear recommendation that project-specific assessment should be done because there are a lot of information gaps that need to be filled when we get to the stage of proposing a specific project and figuring out what it might do to a space and what mitigation measures and monitoring requirements will then need to be imposed on that project to make sure that it happens in the best way possible, and to make sure that we can then learn from that experience here and have every subsequent project hopefully do better and better with the knowledge that we're gaining.
And then maybe a follow-up to that as well, Tina, just for folks that are looking then at this call for information and looking to submit, would you recommend as well taking a look at the regional assessment and recommendations that were put forward in that and preparing those?
Yeah, thanks, Shauna, for that question slash suggestion. I think that's a great idea. And I do think that there's a lot of information in the Regional Assessment Committee's final report that could certainly help folks shape their thinking about the kinds of information they would want to provide and suggestions they would want to make at this time. Particularly if members of the public are thinking about what they would want to suggest in terms of requirements for community benefit plans or environmental protection plans, or other kinds of things that are going to shape the knowledge landscape going forward and the community impact landscape.
Thanks, Tina. Question that I'll send to Renee. Do the Sierra Club, East Coast Environmental Law, and Ecology Action Centre have recommendations for areas of the parcels that are not suitable for development?
At this time, I think that it would only be any areas that might overlap with marine protected areas or areas slated for protection. But really, in terms of the specifics, we're going to be working over the next couple of weeks to develop our positions more thoroughly.
Okay. Question that I'll open for Tina or Renee. Could you provide some examples of what kinds of programs would fall under community benefits? For example, affordable housing on the Eastern Shore is in very short supply, i.e. non-existent. Could there be support for the creation of new housing for the hundreds/thousands of workers and their families who will be building out the turbines? Such a large-scale industrial development will cause far more rapid wear on the Eastern Shore's already rather limited road systems. Do community benefits include beefing up the roads, serving the onshore facilities for building these turbines? So summarize there, like broad scopes, what could be included under community benefit?
So I'm happy to take the first one at that, Renee, if that's okay, and then you can fill in whatever I might miss. So I think this is a big question and an important one, and I have a few thoughts that are pinging here, and so I'll try to say a few things in a relatively organized way. So first of all, I think as a starting point, important to say that the language of the strategic direction and the call for information, when they're thinking about bidding criteria and community benefits within the context of bid criteria, the language is community benefit plans, and there's also language about environmental protection plans. And so I think at this stage we are not going to be seeing necessarily the kinds of details or specific commitments or possibilities that we would ultimately think about seeing in community impact and benefit agreements. So I think, when we get to the stage of actually seeing developers engaging with communities with an aim to develop agreements that are going to provide benefits to communities, I think that's the point where we're more likely to see conversation about what's specifically on offer and what's possible there. And I think, and I'm certainly, I don't have all the knowledge here, and I think there's a lot that we don't know about how all of this will look. But my understanding at this time is that at this stage, we'll probably be seeing dialogue that is at a higher level about what developers are going to be thinking about and planning for in terms of an approach to engaging with communities and seeking to develop community impact and benefit agreements. So that is, I think, the shape of things right now, although we could certainly see things develop a little differently depending on how the information flow and the conversations go over the next little while. What I would say then, kind of in addition to all of that, is that uh, the Regional Assessment Committee in their final report actually had quite a lot of commentary about uh, community impacts like those described in this question and the needs for community infrastructure for communities that would potentially be impacted by influx of workers, by need for housing, by demands on community services, health services, other services, by demands on roads, et cetera. And I think there was a clear recognition by the Regional Assessment Committee, and I think a correct recognition that ultimately individual proponents aren't going to be able to deal with all those issues themselves. An individual proponent is not going to be able to create a community benefit agreement that ensures that there's enough housing and the roads are good and there are medical services available for everyone. And so although I think it's important for those conversations to be on the table and for communities to be thinking about what kinds of impact and benefit agreements would be necessary to make communities comfortable with the impacts they might feel, I also think it's really important for us to collectively recognize that there's a big role for the province in this in terms of funding and support. There's a big role for the federal government in terms of funding and support, and there are big conversations to be had that involve everyone and not just proponents. And it's not just a question of what the proponent's responsibility should be. So I think these are really important things to be thinking about, but I think they're also things that we need to collectively be thinking and talking about and thinking about the big picture solutions that are going to be addressing these issues.
I have nothing to add. That was great.
Okay, gonna give you a second there. I'll jump to the next question. I have a question regarding data gaps. Renee, a favorite topic of yours. When the regulator or later the developers encounter a criterion for which data is missing or incomplete, how is that handled in the licensing process? Is the absence of data interpreted as no issue/conflict and the criterion removed? Or are there mechanisms in place to retain the criterion while addressing the data gaps in another way? More specifically, about social criteria, I mean. So maybe we can do a
I'm
bit of a
really,
broad picture on data, including
yeah,
environmental.
yeah, I'm really curious about the data gaps, the specifics of the question with respect to what is meant by social data. Um, because there are a lot of data gaps in this. Like, for example, for the last question is like, well, what are we going to do about the need for the social services in these communities as these projects develop? Um, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about data gaps in relation to offshore wind. I think that one of the best ways to avoid issues with data gaps is for the government and regulator to work together to have data, to have a list of what data is needed and what structure it's supposed to have, the metadata standards. There's lots of data principles, the FAIR data principles, that's findable, FI. I can't remember the exact acronym right now, but there are strict data standards used across the scientific community and the social sciences community in Canada. And I think that those strict high standards that are held to that academics are held to should also be applied to industry. Um, Having data that is standardized and available for people to work with is how we drive things like research, development, innovation, as well as transparency that supports public trust and support for these kinds of projects moving forward. It allows for um, broad high level analysis of kind of cumulative impact assessment as we get further down the road toward those things, but also just looking at uh, things like bird mortalities versus power generation, it being able to like quantify those regionally. There's lots of different metrics that we can be looking at in this industry, but we can only do that if the data is there, and that it's actually like that there aren't serious data gaps, that there aren't issues with just date standardization. Um, and I think that it will really take leadership to address those, specifically the data that is needed and the format it should take. All of that can be handled ahead of time so that operators don't have questions. And I think that the call for information is an important opportunity for people to ask questions about things like data gaps and how those are going to be addressed. And if you have specific questions and you want to pop those in the chat, this is a great opportunity for us to learn more about things that we can be looking into as well. And as a community, I'm hoping that we can all work together to better identify these gaps and try to find solutions. Anything else? Anything to add?
Yeah, I think I might just add to that I think that when it comes, and I'm not 100% sure that I fully understood the question, whether it was about data gaps that are going to be affecting, bidding and that are going to be, impacting the way that we think about bid criteria. And if that, because I did see, hear language about criteria on there in the question. And so I would say that if the question was about data gaps and how they could affect the bidding process and the application of bidding criteria, I would say that if you look at the bid criteria that are being contemplated, in the strategic direction, the call for information, they're criteria that are about, the developer's technical expertise and capacity, their project readiness, their financial track record, engagement plans, community benefit plans, as we've seen, local content like supply chain, workforce, and training, and then developer kind of perspectives or commitments. We haven't yet seen language, but issues dealing with environmental sustainability, coexistence, biodiversity. So I think some of that definitely implicates data and data gaps, but not to the extent that I would see, an absence of data then potentially affecting the bidding process or the regulator saying, well, we don't have enough data on biodiversity, so we're just not going to consider it. I wouldn't see that happening in terms of affecting criterion in that way, if that's what the question was about. And then the other thing that I would say is that there are going to be data gaps all along the way, and there were data gaps that the Regional Assessment Committee identified, some of which the Regional Assessment Committee thought could be addressed before licensing and before projects get out into the water. But a lot of the data gaps are really data gaps that are going to have to be addressed with projects out in the water, because fundamentally there's a lot that we just won't know until we see how actual turbines out in the water affect the environment, and then learn from that experience. So with all industries, but definitely with this one, it really is about thinking through, the data that we have from other jurisdictions can tell us so much, but then it's not until we actually get projects out in the water here that we're going to see what exactly is being learned. And so there's really a high priority for monitoring, for information collection, for information gathering, for data sharing and evaluation. And so that's going to be an important part of this process for years and years to come. And it won't all be done before projects get out there.
Thanks. A couple of related questions. Oh, yeah, Renee.
Um, just to speak slightly longer to data, um, so for example, we've been asked what areas do we maybe recommend or not recommend for parcels uh, with respect to things like birds and and a data gap there is so my understanding with respect to bird data is that we only really have opportunistic bird data. There hasn't been a really strategic study of birds in the offshore to my knowledge. And it will be hard to make recommendations for parcels in terms of protecting wildlife with if we don't have that data. So, and it is just a matter of collecting.
Mm-hmm. So a follow-up to that one, another question that came in. A few decades ago, research on some areas of the marine floor biological/ecological studies were just beginning and showing surprising results in terms of the richness, diversity, and new adaptation in species. What is in place to require and fund adequate information?
So I think that's a great question. What I can say is that I think that this is a space that has been generating a lot of interest, and I've certainly seen anecdotally over the past few years a lot of interest from academics within the universities here in the province and more broadly, in the region, um, and a fair bit of interest from some potential proponents as well to get out there and to be learning more about all aspects of this. I'm not aware personally of any research on that subject in particular. Um, I, I think this question is about kind of benthic habitat and ecological richness there. So I'm not sure exactly what is happening now and what is being done to kind of assess and get more knowledge as we go forward. So I can't speak to that. But what I can also say is that in terms of ongoing research, it is, I've been speaking a lot about monitoring requirements imposed on specific projects. And it is certainly common for projects after having gone through an environmental impact assessment of some kind, including a federal impact assessment, common for those projects as a condition of approval to have research and monitoring requirements. And in fact, sometimes that is often required as part of the assessment process. That you're gathering the baseline data that allows you to make an informed decision. So I would expect that within whatever parcels are ultimately identified to be open to calls for bids, that we would see new research being done as the prospective proponents are getting ready to propose their projects there, which isn't necessarily enough, and it's certainly not the whole story about research that could be done, um, but I'm also not aware of any kind of comprehensive research program that's about getting out into the offshore and trying to comprehensively assess benthic habitat to learn more about the ecological state of things there and the needs.
Okay. Time for a few more questions. The one that came in, have guidelines already been set to frame some aspects, such as maximum size of turbine or maximum concentration of turbines per unit area?
So I'm not aware of any specific guidelines, formal guidelines that have been set yet. I understand that as things go forward, the regulator will be developing certain guidelines and best practices for proponents. I think um, when it comes to kind of distribution or turbine size, a lot of that ultimately is going to be assessed through the process of inviting bids and then evaluating bids and then assessing proposed projects. I think that, Renee, you can correct me, but I believe the language that you read out earlier about site selection did instruct folks to think about moderate spacing between turbines. So I think there has been a direction set by the federal and provincial minister about what they have in mind as they're instructing the regulator to then invite comments from the public about what we should be imagining in this space. And I think also, we've seen that there's an invitation to think about both fixed and floating turbines, and so I would read into that an implicit invitation to be thinking about, established turbine technologies that would have maybe a more moderate generation capacity, maybe in the 8 to 10 megawatts, but then potentially also, emerging larger turbine technologies that have a larger generating capacity. Where, I think with all of this, you're thinking about trade-offs between size and spacing and number of turbines and impacts and all the rest. So I don't think there's I certainly haven't seen myself any clear, definitive, we are looking for X, Y, or Z. I think there's a lot that is open and on the table right now, and that refining of decisions will be happening in the months to come.
Yeah, so the specific language in the strategic direction says the spatial extent of identified parcels should be based on a moderate megawatt per square kilometer density and include a buffer to accommodate for potentially unsuitable areas for project development. And I think that's something too that is interesting about this question is that this is a rapidly developing technology, and what's on the market today might not be what's on the market a year from now. And so it's hard to answer these questions at this time.
Our last question then for this evening is going to be, what would be your response to people concerned about environmental impact slash relative newness of the technologies?
I'm happy to jump in on that one, Tita. So this is a new technology that is rapidly improving. There have also been offshore wind farms since the early 90s. So it is new, but it's also fairly well established elsewhere in the world. So that's something to keep in mind, I think. And in terms of what was the first part of that question again, Shauna?
What would be your response to people concerned about environmental impact or the newness?
Yeah, I would say that I think everyone, I think that everyone here is concerned about the environmental impact and that we all want to see it minimized. And that's a big part of this work is to balance the critical need for decarbonization. I think that in many, there's no energy project without a footprint. And at the same time, there is a very urgent need to decarbonize our energy systems. And in some ways, it's kind of a harm reduction approach, keeping on this straight and narrow to surpassing climate that all 1.5 to 3 degrees warming. We can't keep on that track. We need to start adapting our energy systems. And so in terms of environmental harm, that's something I think that needs to be included on that scale. And in that same measure, there are lots of ways that we can reduce and mitigate the environmental harm of these projects. Things like bubble curtains. And I feel like I'm learning new things all the time about, because there are different solutions. Lots of people are working on this, and there are solutions out there to minimize harm. And it's important for us to do the research and to be advocating for the use of those techniques in our industry here in Atlantic Canada.
I think I would echo those comments. And as Renee says, I mean, I think probably most on this call are concerned about the environmental impacts. Our three organizations are environmental charities that have been instituted and have committed ourselves to fighting for environmental protection. But as Renee says, it really is right now a moment of extraordinary crisis and urgency when we think about the climate emergency, and there is that urgent need to decarbonize. So I do endorse the harm reduction approach, and I would just add that, in addition to thinking about mitigating the effects of offshore wind projects when they're in the water and the kinds of requirements that can be imposed on projects. Site selection is a big part of this too. So to echo what Renee said earlier, the actual identification and the selection of the specific parcels that will be open to call for bids, that's really going to matter a lot. And I hope my presentation showed that what we've seen over the past several months is a gradual winnowing down in an attempt to select the sites that are going to be the best in terms of avoiding some of the clearest environmental conflicts and conflicts also with other ocean users. So, the Regional Assessment Committee recommended quite a large area that overlapped with the marine protected area. And that was ultimately deselected from the designation of wind energy areas and is not currently on the table. So the hope is that as we continue in this call for information process and the regulator is coming to an opinion on specific parcels that should be open to calls for bids, the hope is that the parcels identified will be parcels that are continuing to avoid the sites that have the clearest ecological conflicts. And as we've been saying, there's a lot that we don't know and we can't actually plan for right now because we're missing a lot of data. But I think the best that the regulator and the governments are going to be able to do is go forward on the best information possible, and certainly they're trying right now to gather as much information as they can to make the most informed decisions, and that's why it's so important for those with information to come forward during this process and contribute as best they can.
Great. Okay, I did like, so we still have a few extra minutes, so I'm gonna throw out couple more questions here. Do the inshore facilities already meet the needs of this industry? For example, building and shipping the components to the marine sites?
So I think the short answer to that is no, not quite yet. There's been a fair bit of work done on the need for port upgrades and other upgrades that are going to be necessary. And so I think there's a lot of attention to be being paid to what is going to be necessary to get onshore facilities ready. And I don't think we're there yet.
Thanks, Tina. And then what will actually be our last question. Looking at data gaps, one example of a data gap relates to fisheries in the site and definitely parcels later selection process for offshore wind. The analysis considered conflicts between OSW farms and fisheries, but industrial fisheries only. Local and Indigenous fisheries were not included as there are no maps showing their activities, even though they represent a significant criterion that should be considered both in the call for bids and in the criteria used to evaluate bid applications. So I guess just any thoughts or comments related to that.
I think this is something that my understanding is that both regional assessment committees struggled with. So there was a regional assessment for Nova Scotia, as I said, and there was a parallel regional assessment for Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think in both processes, there was a struggle to gather adequate fisheries information. And I think that ultimately there was an onus placed on fishers and fishing communities to share as much information as they could with the applicable authorities to have that information informed decisions. And so I think that there are some considerations that are relevant to information sharing when it comes to small scale fisheries. And so it's a complex issue for sure. And I don't want to overstep by or oversimplify by saying it's just a matter of sharing information. But I do think it's really important for fishers and fishing communities to be engaging during this period and to be communicating with the regulator about areas that they think ought not be open to offshore wind, because I do think that this is really the time to be informing those decisions. And whatever information was collected in the past by the Regional Assessment Committee, what we're doing or what the regulator is doing now, what we collectively are trying to input into, it's building on that, but ultimately it's not going to be enough in all cases, and this is the moment to provide more.
Great. Thank you both, Renee and Tina, for your presentations and for your answers and thoughts and comments. And thank you everybody who asked questions as well. Really appreciate those. Tina or Renee, any closing thoughts you want to put out there, comments before we end off?
I'll just say that I hope that everyone contributes their insights and expertise to this call for information. And if you have any questions or concerns, would like some support or someone to chat with about what you're thinking about submitting, please reach out. We'll follow up by email.
Yeah, I would echo those comments. And I would also say, again, I noted this at the end of my presentation, but for those who are wanting to know more about how our organizations are engaging in this space and what we're doing and what kind of perspective and research and analysis we're bringing to the table in all of this, please check our individual websites. Also, right now, the Ecology Action Centre is hosting a web page for the coalition and our work together as a group. And so there's information there as well about how we're working together. And of course, feel free to reach out to us directly as well if you want to know more about the perspectives we're bringing and the positions we're taking on all of this.
Both, and yeah, as a reminder to everybody, we will be uploading this recording as well, and it'll be emailed to you after it's uploaded, along with all of the links and the contact information for all of us in the website. So please do feel free to follow up with us and stay tuned, and we look forward to staying in touch with you all. So hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening, and thank you again for joining us.